and welcome to Note Doctors. My name is Paul.
My name is Jenn.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In this podcast, we will be talking about all things theory with some of the best music theory teachers in the country. If you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. We are so excited for this episode. This is really an end of the semester holiday break treat because this is our second episode made in collaboration with the fine folks at the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, in which we are talking to not just one theorist, not two, not 3, 4, or even 5, but 6 music theorists on an article that they worked together to create called Corralling the Chorale, which will be coming out in next year's volume of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. And so this article features Chelsea Burns, William O'Hara, Marcelle Pierson, Kate Pukinskis, Peter Smucker, and William van Geest. It's a great conversation. You're going to learn so much and hopefully get you excited to read their article. Again, we want to give a huge shout out to the fine folks at the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, Steve Lates, Rebecca Jemian, David Thurmeyer, Jenny Snodgrass for helping us put these together. It's been a blast, and we hope that we can collaborate again in the future. So here is our conversation on Corralling the Chorale.
It really struck me how the chorale permeates our music theoretical instruction, at least if these textbooks are in any indication.
There's a kind of voice leading that is good, and that is like Bach. But then there's actually like a lot of music I like that doesn't, use that kind of voice leading at all. And so to call it good is actually, there's a problem there, I think.
What I prioritize in my classes with my students is encouraging them to be flexible in their expectations of how these things we teach them in the abstract actually show up or get used or utilized in music.
I think one of the good things about looking at Neo-Romanian theory is that it's such a different view of voice leading, and it totally hinges on voice leading, but it brings you into totally different styles of music.
Try to think long-term, try to think the long game, small incremental changes, but within those incremental changes, that actually gives you more and more opportunities to present those ideas to your faculty.
I think actually one of the things that really works well about the colloquy is the way in which having this one very focused touch point allows us to radiate out with all of these questions that sort of permeate the rest of our work as well.
So today our very special guests are actually a handful of colloquy. So in the academic tradition of having words that are hard to spell and pronounce, we have a whole group of folks with us and who have come together to write an article on the upcoming JMTP on Corralling the Chorale. And I think this is an amazing paper. I loved reading it. We have so many questions to ask. We'll get to maybe a handful of them, but it's such a rich article. And today will be just kind of like an amuse-bouche, just something to whet your appetite for what you'll be able to read in full detail in the article when it comes out in January. So before we get started with the details, I want to just kind of go around and have folks introduce themselves, their name, their article, and kind of where they're at. And hopefully as a listener, you can remember what their voices sound like, because there'll be a lot of voices in here. And so who's talking, it might be a little bit tricky, but we're going to have a good time. So I'll start. I see Peter there. And so if you would start, and then we'll kind of go around.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Pete Smucker. I am an associate professor of music at the Stetson School of Music in DeLand, Florida. I'm also the director of music theory here. And my essay is titled Administering Pedagogy, Navigating the Institutional Impacts of a Changing Theory Curriculum.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Burns. I'm an assistant professor of music theory at the University of Texas at Austin. And my contribution to the colloquy is about just the difficulties and challenges associated with making curricular change.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kate Pukinskis. I'm a visiting assistant professor in music at Amherst College, in Amherst, Mass. And my contribution for the colloquy is titled Decentering the Chorale in Undergraduate Music Theory Courses, Why and How.
Hi, I'm Bill O'Hara. I'm an assistant professor at Gettysburg College, and my contribution to the colloquy is called Neo-Romanian Theory as Voice-Leading Pedagogy. And it details some of the things that I do in my Theory 3 class with Neo-Romanian Theory.
I'm Marcelle Pierson. I teach music theory at the University of Pittsburgh, and my contribution is called Reconsidering the Role of Voice Leading in the Undergraduate Theory Curriculum. And it's about kind of how we think about voice leading and how that plays into the more general concept of kind of curricular overhaul and chorales.
Yeah, my name is William van Geest. I am finishing off a PhD at the University of Michigan. My contribution is called The Chorale in American Music Theory, a corpus study of leading textbooks.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us on our largest Note Doctors episode of all time. And so we're going to start off just with talking about a little bit how this group came together. And so how do 6 music theorists come together in agreement on something? And how do you start that off?
Well, I can chime in. This is Pete. And, this actually started years ago, certainly pre-pandemic. A lot of us knew each other, actually, and we're colleagues together at University of Chicago, myself and Marcy and Kate and Chelsea. But we also knew Bill just as friends and, through conferences and that sort of thing. But this, I think back to maybe, and you guys can correct me, 2016 or 2017 or so, we were all sort of either finishing up our graduate studies or about to go into the job market and getting sort of our first jobs and that sort of thing. And we wanted to stay connected. We were like, oh, we're all leaving each other. And, how do we want to stay connected? And we decided to kind of do this before Zoom got big. We wanted to meet up and decided, let's talk about pedagogy, talk about our jobs, and we could commiserate a little bit with each other, but also we ended up picking topics. And so we met every, couple of months or every 2 or 3 months or so. And we just talked about grading and our new jobs and, well, what did you do? And we shared resources. And there were other people involved in this too. There was, anywhere from, 6 to 8 to 10, maybe some people came and went. And then I'm going to give credit to Marcy. I think Marcy's like, hey, I met this guy, William. He's got this really cool project he's working on. And so William joined us then also. And it was through that, it was sort of one of the topics we were wanting to talk about William's project. And I think after that, so this would have been 2018, probably around there. And we said, maybe this would be a cool panel to pitch at one of the conferences. And so those of us, the 6 of us, we thought, oh, we could maybe put something together and contribute. So we decided to put that together. And then I don't remember whose idea it was. I think it was Marcy again. I'm going to give you credit, Marcy, was to say, well, we need a respondent. And so we thought of Dr. Jennifer Snodgrass. Her textbook, I think, had just recently come out. And we thought that would be great if we could get her on board. And she was enthusiastic and said yes. And so that was kind of everything that led up to how we got to pitching this to SMT.
If it's okay, if I interject on that, just to clarify one point, I think the impetus behind the SMT panel was, first of all, to represent what this group had been doing, namely just getting together and talking about pedagogy, pedagogical issues, and particularly like supporting scholars at, in the early stages of teaching. And it was, and just saying what's sort of possible, we hope more people do this sort of thing. And then we said, okay, what sort of topic will we choose? And, among the various topics that we had discussed in that context, chorale rose to the surface, probably because we have this snappy title. And so it was, I think I just wanted to represent that aspect of this group, because I think it's a really valuable thing that was going on, this meeting on a more or less monthly basis to just support each other and sharpen our pedagogical chops.
Yeah, just as like a quick sort of sampling of the topics that we discussed, we would try to have a focus each month, something on, popular music and how you work with that in your curriculum, or, integrating versus separating out, or fugues and whether you teach them and how to think about that in relation to teaching counterpoint, topics like that, right? So chorale was one of the topics that we had come through. This is Chelsea talking.
Yeah, one of the points that I think came across in a lot of your papers was, if you want to move outside of the textbook, what do you do at that point? What resources do you draw from, and to draw on your support network? I know Paul and Jen and I have definitely done similar things. So it's good. It's really healthy for the field to see these kinds of things going on, especially when we get outside of the books. I think it's great.
Yeah, I found that to be invaluable, just because I certainly had my ideas, and some of us had common experiences maybe at University of Chicago, but Bill and William and some of the others, that they just brought different ideas, and whatever schools we ended up being, we all go to different types of schools, different types of institutions. And so, yeah, to anybody listening, find a group of friends and get together and do this. It's been really, really great for us.
It's one of the things you sort of miss after grad school too. You go from being immersed in this to, you might, either you're starting in a new job and you're like the new person, or you're starting a job like some of us are at institutions where we're like the theorist, or maybe one of two theorists or something like that. So it's really nice to kind of carry that through. And I looked up, and I think we can give some credit to Chelsea specifically with the fugue thing. That's one of the earliest emails I can find. And Pete sends an email to all of us saying like, hey, I think we should all, get together. And what if we, wouldn't it be great to talk about things like that regularly? She got this really great discussion going on Facebook. Like, let's continue it.
I was just going to say that the beginning of this podcast is really similar, because that's how we started, by just talking, and we would present in one of Paul's pedagogy classes. And that's when we realized it's so helpful to talk to colleagues about how you teach and what you teach and why, and all of those things, and keeping that is a regular part of what you do is such a gift and a really helpful tool to have.
And if I can add one more thing to what Bill was saying, is that even in grad school, this is kind of tagging on to Lee Van Handel's point, is that you didn't get the proper preparation to teach film music in all your classes and popular music examples and musical examples outside the canon. I mean, we have to rely on each other at that point, even when you're in graduate school, in my opinion. But that's a little bit more nuanced, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I actually, my PhD is in composition. It's not in theory. And so many jobs out there are for theory comp or comp theory, or it's a part of the work. And I have always really loved, teaching theory and thinking about composing from an analytical perspective, but definitely really benefited, especially in the early days, but continued to benefit from this wonderful group of people when I'm just like, hey, I have to teach a course on such and such, or I have to teach a lesson on this, and I have no materials. And we never talked about this in the sort of thread or current of my practices as a composer. So getting some extra support there also was really helpful. And even in this group, sort of drawing on our different areas of expertise outside of theory pedagogy has been really helpful. Chelsea is also, heavily leaning into musicology. And so thinking about those influences also helps us expand and challenge, our space.
Well, Kate, I'm here for you with the PhD in composition. So we have to stick together, because we do well in theory, but there are some things that were just like, I didn't learn that. I know how to write atonal music and experimental things, but how does counterpoint work again? It's funny how little counterpoint training you get in a doctorate with composition sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Or that we're utilizing it in a very, very different way than 16th and 18th century traditions.
Exactly. So let's turn to some of the essays. So we'll just start with the first essay in the article, and that's by William, and that's where you're on your corpus study on leading textbooks and the use of the chorale. And so it's a really fascinating article, and we could spend this whole time talking about kind of what you found in there, but we'll kind of hit the highlights of it. But what were some of the most kind of interesting things that you found in your investigation of the textbooks in regards to the use or even like overuse of chorales?
Yeah, Yeah, there was sort of a lot packed in there, at least from my perspective. I'm, this is sort of the a nugget version of what sort of triggered my dissertation. So yeah, I think there's a lot there. So in response to your question, I think I would say, well, first of all, the use overuse thing. My goal in the essay is not to be particularly prescriptive. I do hope that people who read it will say, oh, this is interesting stuff. How will I change my pedagogy, reinforce or modify, say, based on what I learned from this. In terms of interesting findings, I would say it really struck me how the chorale permeates our music theoretical instruction, at least if these textbooks are in any indication, which is sort of the point of the corpus study. So, if you look at the examples that authors will pull, there's just a fairly high proportion of them being what they call chorales. And among those, tons of Bach's four-part chorale harmonizations. We also use them to illustrate, we use, stuff chorale adjacent to illustrate, principles of harmony and voice leading. We assign chorale harmonization for exercises, right? So I guess all of this sort of led me to realize there's, the chorale in music theory that's essentially specific to music theory and related to what everyone else calls chorale, but its own thing, So if you say the word chorale to an American music theorist, they'll understand something very specific, or a number of things actually, by the term that just is essentially different from the rest of the field. And I tried to highlight that in my essay by means of the reference to the Grove Dictionary, which is the main dictionary, English language dictionary for the field. So yeah, to sort of enumerate the parts of, or analyze what's all bundled up in that concept. I think that's again what triggered my dissertation. So yeah, that's the sort of how big that concept is and how attached it is to some of the deepest music theoretical commitments of our field's practitioners. That was really striking to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just interesting how you mentioned if an aria or a choral work or other works that have text or art song, they will include the text, the translations, all these things. But that chorale is not treated in the same way. It's treated as like this abstract object that has no history almost. And it makes me think of, I was thinking of, it was a video or interview I saw. It was basically talking about how there was a strange voice leading thing in this Bach chorale. And this one student was like, well, I know why that is, because the lyric of that is, is crucified or something. And that's why there's that weird dissonance. But the student knew that because he was a Lutheran. He grew up in a Lutheran church. Whereas, for most students who don't come from that tradition, they're not going to have that insight. They see these as these kind of very abstract things. So can you talk a little bit about how we've abstracted these chorales and what would help, how would a more robust understanding of where they come from and what they do help us?
Yeah, so as you say, it is sort of striking how chorales are dealt with idiosyncratically compared with other repertoire. They it's just sort of inconsistent. And so I focus on Bach's four-part chorale harmonizations and their visual presentation in these textbooks, which you can find some common themes across them. So first of all, I mentioned the extraction from a larger musical work, right? To be sure, there's a whole lot of these four-part harmonizations by Bach that we don't know the origins of, but for those we do know the origins of, they're often extracted from say a cantata or a passion or something like that. And they play a dramatic role. They connect with all sorts of themes in the cantata, and of course they're liturgical and that sort of thing. And that's not how they're presented in these books. They're just it's a chorale, and especially for those authors that identify them according to a number. That number refers to the edition, right? And the edition collects all these chorales sort of extracted from these larger works. But yeah, another aspect that you mentioned is the lack of text in the score, on these examples. And there's a fair amount sort of connected with a text that's in a score. First of all, it simply indicates that the thing is sung. It's for chorus. Second of all, that it's German, right? If you're including the German text, so it gives a sort of cultural connection. And third of all, if you can decipher the German, or if there's a translation appended, then you get a sense that it's liturgical, right? When you remove that text from the score, all that sort of disappears, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other aspect that I mentioned is compacting it onto two staves. So if you open, for example, the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, you'll find, the chorale settings at the end of cantata, say on 4 separate staves, which is pretty conventional, right, for choral music. When you drop them onto 2 staves like that, and you omit the text and anything else that suggests, this deeper context, like you mentioned, it's sort of unclear what it is, right? 2 staves is common for keyboard music, and of course, there's tons of keyboard music as well in these textbooks. So it would be easy to think this is a keyboard piece, although musical texture is quite unidiomatic for the keyboard. So it sort of occupies this strange, ambiguous place. Is it instrumental music? Is it vocal music? I think it's particularly interesting when you put side by side how these chorales are presented visually. If you compare that to our representations of the texture, the musical texture that we use to represent principles of harmony and voice leading, and they're pretty similar, as I think it's one of the examples in the end of my book. And so I don't know, it's awfully remarkable how much they resemble each other. And I raised the point that I don't think it's coincidental. We call that illustration texture chorale style. So it feels sort of mushy between how we present this idiosyncratic visual presentation of chorales and this demonstration texture. I don't know if that gets at your question a little bit.
I think it does, because you bring up that really interesting point of how they're kind of mutually reinforce each other. This is how chorale looks, and this is how these kind of harmonic examples look, and they look exactly the same. So they're it's almost like the authors are validating their own writing, because it's so close to what the chorales look like by Bach. And so I never really thought about that, but it's a really kind of interesting thing when you point that out. Wow, they're that's the same. The Bach chorale, the setup is the same as how we have these abstracted voice leading examples, and then vice versa, right? Yeah. And so as we kind of wrap up with that, what reasons do authors give for using chorales to teach voice leading? I think we all kind of have reasons that, why it would be the case, but in textbooks, because that's where, students encounter these things. And so oftentimes textbooks are going to explain the importance of them to students. What are the reasons to teach the chorale?
Yeah, so there's a host of different appeals that authors make, and I think sort of curious number of them. So one of them is just this is the way it's always been done. This is how we teach music theory in this tradition, right? Another one is an appeal to sort of musical style or musical genre, there's a lot of music that is in 4 parts, string quartets, or other choral music, right? Another one is this sort of what I call compositional norm, that is to say, in the sense of composers compose this way, even if it doesn't end up in 4 parts. This is the way this is the way people compose. Maybe our composers around the table here can speak to that. There's also like appeal to biological norms, like, well, men and women, and 2 parts each, and also appeal to the biology of the voice, what the voice is capable of. So there's a variety of things like that, and I don't know. Sometimes I wonder whether there's a sort of anxiety expressed in that, like, that authors realize to a certain extent how much they rely on chorales, and it sort of bothers them, right? And they try to appeal to justify why they do so. And I don't know, are they grasping for straws? I'm not sure. But I do find, like I say, I find the variety and the strength of the appeal, intriguing.
Can I just interject one thing here? I loved, William, what you said of the composers, maybe this is sort of why or how they compose in this direction. And I think it's really interesting working with undergraduate composers in particular. They're often really preoccupied by harmony and harmonic progression. And I hadn't really thought about it until you just said this, but it sort of yields an interesting chicken or egg moment, I think. And I can only speak from my experience in undergraduate studios and composition, but I spend a lot of time trying to encourage students to explore creative work from a place that doesn't originate with harmony. And I wonder if some of that is coming from, how we're thinking about introducing undergraduates to music theory.
Yeah, and even if we look at the very beginning, right, of the colloquy with the anecdote of the poor student who thought, well, look, we learn principles of harmony and voice leading based on this 4-part homophonic notionally vocal thing. So if I want to harmonize something, that's the way I'm going to do it, right? Like, is there any other way, right? And of course, the instructor in our anecdote has to sort of walk things back a little bit, right? So yeah, I think this is a really, really common thing.
Yeah, and even tagging on to that, you make a great point. That even some examples that are not Bach chorales are reduced to Bach chorales, as if that's a way of seeing through to the, the composer's vision or something, that it's not even a chorale, but it's like made into a chorale. And then you have this even further kind of abstracting into abstract models. I know a lot of the recordings in the Lates book are like that. You'll play it, and I think, oh, that wasn't the right one. It was just a chorale. But then I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that was that kind of represented the voice leading or something of the example. And it wasn't even a chorale that I'm looking at in the text. So yeah, it's a fantastic point.
That's one of the places that I find things get really interesting. I'll stop talking in a sec. But, that's the topic of musical structure, right? And it's something you find in most of the textbooks that I survey, that this demonstration texture, it's no accident that we use this 4-part homophonic notionally vocal texture, because on some level we think it represents tonal music, right? This is like a more real version or a more essential version of music. So we can take a piece with any number of parts, whether more or fewer than 4, and we turn it into a more essential version of it. And we say, oh, this is the structure of this piece, and we've accepted that as completely legitimate. And I definitely don't. Well, I'll say this: it seems like it does have explanatory power. It wouldn't have held on as it does if it didn't have some explanatory power. Although I do get concerned that what repertoire does this sort of legitimize or normalize, because it explains, that structure, the model explains repertoire in helpful ways, and what repertoire does it exclude, for example, right? And even, just to be so focused on pitch to this extent, what are the consequences of that for what we're passing on to our students?
If you don't mind me jumping in on this, just the way, one of the things this is Chelsea, one of the things I really love about William's work on this is that he really centers this one structure and kind of helps us see all kinds of ways that it reiterates the kinds of problems that are being addressed sort of urgently in the field right now, right? And so I think all of us in this group at some point or another have said, well, this feels like just talking about the chorale in some ways feels too small, like we have too many things we need to be thinking about in more thoroughgoing ways in the curriculum, in the field, like while we've been talking here about these issues of natural representation, there's been some discussion in the chat about issues of like the trans voice, but also questions of like the canon and all kinds of things. But I think actually one of the things that really works well about the colloquy is the way in which having this one very focused touch point allows us to radiate out with all of these questions that sort of permeate the rest of our work as well. So it provides some focus to the discussion, but our concerns are related to these larger field-wide concerns. So
I think that's absolutely true. And I experienced that as a reader. So, you all wrote these articles and you've had a lot of discussion about them leading up to this. But as I was reading it, thinking about just this one object that we do use quite a bit, and they show up in our texts quite a bit. And I was thinking about how it's not really, the way they appear is not really chorale style, it's hymn style, really. And I grew up in, because hymns are written that way on two staves and, with this very sort of strict structure. I grew up in a church with like a really rich singing tradition. That's how I learned to improvise harmony and all of those things. And I had a moment of like a chicken or egg moment while I was reading the articles thinking, am I a music theorist because I learned harmony through hymns? Because I got to college and experienced I got to music theory and was like, well, all of this makes sense. Why is everyone so confused? This all makes perfect sense. Because that was essentially how I was trained in many ways leading up to that point, even while I could, as a horn player, be like, but in orchestra, we don't do this. And in band, we don't really do this, right? So I really experienced that through the article, that feeling of like, you're right, it excludes rhythm in a lot of ways. Rhythms are very simple in chorale structures, hymn structures. It excludes almost even non-chord tones in a lot of ways. Suspensions are very prevalent, maybe passing tones, but lots of other things are very uncommon in those structures. So there's so much that it leaves out, and those things just kind of ripple out from there. As you start to realize them, you're like, oh, and this, and this, and this. So I appreciated that a lot.
Yeah, totally. Maybe one of those things would be voice leading. That's probably connected very closely, which brings me to Marcy, the second essay. In the colloquy, really enjoyed reading what you put together, and you're reconsidering the role of voice leading. So can you talk to us about some of your main points and share them, and we can discuss that as well.
Yeah. But I mean, so much of what kind of I'm doing, like William's work is so foundational to so much of what I do in this too, because he just like establishes kind of like a basic, that chorales are prevalent and stuff like that. And so, I was sort of, in our kind of presentation, I presented on something different, but then in the responses to our presentation at SMT, I kept seeing kind of voice leading come up as like, okay, well, we can get rid of the chorale, but like voice leading is obviously like this sacred thing that we shouldn't, that is important, indubitably, no argument there. And I was kind of like, wait, though, like, is it? I mean, and so that's kind of what where that question came from. So I'm thinking about what we mean when we talk about voice leading, and when we talk about voice leading, we're almost always talking about voice leading in the style of Bach, in the style of Bach chorales, the kind of things that have been extrapolated from Bach chorales. And this is, I make the point in the essay that this is like a really common, that like if you look up voice leading in Grove, it sends you to part writing. So these things are like completely interlinked, kind of conceptually in the field of music theory. And I find like I'm actually teaching a Counterpoint course right now, and I'm trying to train myself out of talking about good voice leading and just talking about like Bach style voice leading, which is not natural for me. It's like, so ingrained in me that there's a kind of voice leading that is good, and that is like Bach. But then there's actually like a lot of music I like that doesn't, use that kind of voice leading at all. And so to call it good is actually, there's a problem there, I think. So that's kind of like what I'm exploring in this essay.
Yeah, that's a great point. I personally, maybe this is just me, but I like these 5 kind of ways you kind of put together this spectrum continuum of, if you are listening to this podcast and you say, you know what, I'm sold. I want to decenter my teaching of the chorale, and I want to do the following with voice leading. You kind of propose this kind of set of 5 kind of lines paths that you could pursue, I guess. I thought that was really interesting. Maybe I thought you could share some of those, because I think a lot of people listening to this, it's going to resonate and they're going to say, where do I go from here?
Yeah. So I have these 5 ideas, and some of them are combinable, some of them aren't. And I kind of do a combination of a few of them, but not all of them personally in my teaching. So the first one is to kind of teach, this is, I think, the most modest, but just teach counterpoint without chorales, kind of do 2 voice counterpoint, think about how voices move against each other without kind of putting it in this chorale format, which I know some people kind of focus more on 2-part writing and things like that. The second idea is to postpone I'm calling it box style voice leading, just to be specific about what we're talking about. So to postpone it until later in a curriculum. So I do this, the students kind of learn keyboard style with no they don't worry about parallels and stuff like that until theory 3, when we start talking about voice leading. So they just, they learn harmony. It gives us a lot more time in theory 1 to focus on harmony and cool, chords and stuff like that, which I think is more widely useful for some of our students, some of whom only take theory 1. So that's the second idea, is just teach it later, and maybe only to some students if you have a modular curriculum, or students can choose what they take. Another option would be to teach box style voice leading comparatively. So to be this is one kind of voice leading, now let's look at this, let's look at power chords and talk about what kind of voice leading that is, and that's also a good decision and meets the goals of both cultural and musical of the music that it's in. So yeah, different logics, different musics, different logics of voice leading, kind of comparative analysis there. The fourth idea is to teach voice leading more generally, in a way that applies more broadly across different kinds of music. So if we're just talking about fluency of voice, having voices sort of move mostly stepwise or something like that, that's a pretty more universal concept, not entirely, but more so. And we can talk about what tendency tones are in different styles and how they behave. And so there's kind of looser, more generalizable things to extract, where we're still talking about voice leading, but in a broader sense. And then the final idea is just to not teach voice leading at all. And I confess, I don't know exactly what this would look like. I feel like voice leading is pretty important for triadic music, and I don't know of a music program that doesn't focus on triadic music. Maybe, in the States, I don't know of one, but, or in North America, but but there could be kind of programs not focused on triadic music. And so, I want to keep open the option of voice leading not being important in a particular context at all, just as kind of the limit case.
Right. Hot take. We love hot takes on here. I love it. I've been also rethinking just the phrase model. I used to say on your composition project, if you're stuck, well, think about the phrase model. But now I just asked them a question. Did you follow the phrase model? Why or why not? Explain. And I just kind of let them talk about what they did and kind of understand it. But then I didn't follow the phrase model. I wanted to do planing of diminished chords because it was a lightsaber battle between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. And that's just what came to mind. You know what I mean? And some of them wrote that. And I thought that was really cool. It's great,
Yeah, it's a real difference. I think So the theory, I went to Oberlin, and the theory curriculum there, assumed that we all engaged with classical music to a large degree. And so assumed that these things we were hearing were familiar, that we'd somehow know kind of good voice leading, even though we were really bad at it in theory class, we could learn it, it would make sense. But I think increasingly we can't some students like come in thinking about lightsabers, some come in thinking about, this or that. And so you can't assume that like something will sound right to students. You have to like do the work to play enough of the kind of music for them if you really want them to learn like a particular kind of music.
And if I could jump in just really quickly on this, I mean, with Marcy's essay, which is great and sort of opening up this spectrum, as you're calling it. And I think one thing that I think is happening is that there's just more recognition of the types of institutions, the types of places that are more accepting of different things, rather than sort of assuming it's going to be this one thing if you're going to be classically trained. And my hope is that this kind of continues. So there is this, I don't know what the right word for this is, just sort of not a flattening or a globalization or a all-encompassing ecumenical, I don't know what sort of, like everything is welcome and is happening. And it's not that if you're on this end of the spectrum, that's less good or bad than anywhere else. And I think as pluralistic, fantastic, all sorts of words we could come up with. So that's one of the things I think what Marcy, I think, opens up really nicely, and institutions need to, I think about that. Even if an institution is defined in a certain way, understanding that there are all these other equally viable possibilities and models for curriculum, I think is good. And,
preparing our students for the reality of the world they enter, which is that like the, interpretation is less and less of kind of what musicians do, like interpretation being sort of like reading music that already exists. So that being less and less of the kind of professional like goals or the professional endpoints of our students.
And I can't remember if it was your article, it maybe yours, Marcy, where you mentioned how if this voice leading is so natural and so the way it should be, why is it so difficult for students to do it? I thought that was a great point. Like, if it's so natural and obvious, why is it one of the hardest things for students to even do?
Right. There's some kind of disconnect there, right? Like of it being this ideal, like beautiful structure, that just undergirds everything we listen to, and it being like, my students in Theory 3 still not, still not able, or, students will go through 2 years of theory and not be able to, and not catch the parallel fifths. They won't hear them, they won't see them. So what does that mean?
At the same time, I also wonder whether one of the motivations for including, things like voice leading and or including isn't quite right. Building our curricula around voice leading and harmony is that it's easy to grade. It's easy to say yes, no. Even when Marcy mentioned her fifth option, like don't work on voice leading. I don't know what that would look like. I feel like that's kind of the problem, right? Like it's easy, it lends itself to our institutions, right? And the attitude that we, that our institutions are founded on, right? And I don't know whether we're doing our students a service, if it's unnatural, if what we're teaching them is so difficult for them to sort of get a handle on. But on the other hand, it makes grading easy. You can lay out a rubric and everyone knows what they're getting points off for, I don't know. I don't know if we should be comfortable with that, right? And again, what possibilities we're sort of ruling out in the process.
A lot of the points that folks have been saying really, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jen.
Well, I was about to say that's a great transition to your article. So, if you want to talk about some of the challenges of making curricular changes like that,
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of the points that my colleagues have been making are exactly the ones that I make in my contribution, which are just that there are so many challenges, right? And it might depend on how much freedom you have in your curriculum. It might depend on how concerned you are about what you're not sure they might face in their graduate placement exams. It might be about how much freedom you have with your colleagues and coordination. The one that I've been thinking about the most is exactly the thing that Marcy was talking about, and also Pete, to some extent, this issue of like what we're actually preparing students to do. And I think that's the place that I feel actually kind of stuck at this point, just trying to think about it. It's like I want to know what possibilities might exist for our students. And so part of that is, what are they actually doing when they come out? But that is, of course, shaped by what they've been taught to do. And so, like, I think considering, for example, like, what would it mean for a bassoon player to come out without having gone through the track of learning the standard bassoon rep, but having learned something else, right? That what might they be able to teach future bassoon students, right? Like right now, all of it is of a piece that presumes a classical curriculum. And I don't mean to say like we should be doing pop instead. I mean to say that I really genuinely would love to sort of think bigger about what it means to be a musician. And if that's the case, what tools one might need to do that. And I think that requires not just the theory program and not just, not just our own core curricula, but like, how do I communicate with that bassoon teacher? I mean, I don't mean to single out the bassoon teacher. I really like the bassoon teacher at UT, but anybody, any performance faculty member, to help get them on board as well, to think more broadly about what it means to educate an undergraduate student in a curriculum or a graduate student in a curriculum, and what they might be able to go forth and do. And I think that remains sort of an unaddressed issue for me. And some of that can be figured out by talking to our graduates, but I want to do some other thinking about it as well. And I would love to do that work in collaboration with folks between performance and academic studies, to get some more cross-fertilization there. I don't know if that quite answered your question. There are a lot of challenges, is what I mean to say, and they're big. And some of them are these textbook issues, right? Like if you want to make a change, there aren't like a whole lot of alternatives. And also maybe the faculty in the other semesters use the textbook a lot. So the students come through really prepared to use that textbook. And then you start saying, oh, but we're not going to use those kinds of structures anymore. It sort of can alienate them from what they've understood to be a reference material. It takes retraining for us. There are all kinds of ways that it's hard and ways that it is unequal in terms of labor, because so much of core curriculum is taught by untenured folks, non-ladder folks, contingent faculty, graduate assistants, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of work for everybody.
Really appreciated that you brought in that element. We had an earlier podcast guest who mentioned, like, you guys have talked a lot about incorporating popular music, and that's fantastic, but I'm a contingent faculty member. I only have so much time. I'm working other jobs too. And I already know these examples. I already know this music, and it's serving my students fairly well. And that is something to consider, how many adjuncts and, like you said, teaching fellows and people with really heavy loads are carrying the core curriculum, really. I'm lucky to be in a situation where that's less the case, but when it comes to the written curriculum, myself and my other full-time colleague teach all the 4 semesters between us. And so that gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of kind of ability to make change fairly easily. But you're absolutely right that most people are not in that situation. And it's definitely something to think about, because I think when we get so excited about curricular change, we forget about the aspects that you mentioned. Like, we have colleagues who might not be excited, or we have a textbook that students have already paid for, or we have, there's all of these other elements that you have to think about. And for me, it's more that it's a long game. You have to change things. Our curriculum has dramatically changed in the nearly 10 years that I've been at DBU, where I teach right now. But it has happened really slowly across a long period of time. And as you mentioned, you have to plan for incremental change, and you have to plan for things to be retooled and restructured again. And, it's not a straight line, not at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, going off of what Chelsea was saying, that I feel like in a lot of ways, Chelsea's paper and Pete's paper are really central to the big picture of this group. I mean, it's been about 2 years since we did this panel initially, and it's something that I'm sure we've all continued thinking about. But one of the things that I feel like I see over and over is the need to really be strategic and to really kind of talk with our colleagues in other areas. Because I think in those 2 years, a lot of music theorists have spent a lot of time thinking about this, but you also need to talk to your applied people. You need to talk to your ensembles. You really, I think that it would be really great if we saw more departments and schools of music in the next few years really looking at the big picture and asking that really tough question that Chelsea asks, which is like, what do we actually want our students to know, and why, and what are we preparing them for? Even as we agree, we want to do more of this and less of that in theory, we, in a way, we're kind of preaching to the choir in terms of all the people listening to this podcast and on this panel, that we're all engaged in thinking about how to do this differently. But we also need to have those conversations, and the other areas of our schools need to have those conversations with us.
I'm lucky to work in a place where we have been doing that for several years as a full faculty, but there's also only 7 of us on the full-time music faculty. And we're fairly like-minded about these things. And we recognize often how fortunate that is, because it's not the case all the time everywhere. We have applied colleagues who will ask things like, are you doing okay in theory? It's really important. Or how's music history going? You have to know that stuff. So we have a very supportive group of us, but that's not always the case. And sometimes people just take longer to come around too. I think the question of what our students need was really central to your article, Chelsea. And I appreciated that you don't just say like, well, clearly they need this. It's such a complex problem, and we don't know. We don't know the answer. We have no idea what they need.
Yeah, I think there's still this operation of like, well, for a traditional conservatory student who's headed maybe to an orchestra or something. And I think, well, how many of our traditional students are headed to orchestras, right? Like maybe they're headed to something that is orchestra adjacent in some way, right? I mean, I don't mean to say like throw concert music out the window, but it's not entirely clear to me that that's necessarily the normative path that we ought to be preparing students for. I think about, being in Texas, I think about all of the, all of the marching bands and all of that rep, and how that rep bears some relationship to the music we're teaching them, but not necessarily. And also, just thinking in my specific program, they take a course in which they learn about transposing instruments and everything after they're done with their core theory courses. So when you want to say, well, I would love to incorporate more band rep, okay, you better be ready to make your own reductions of all of it, and so that they can read it, because they, the instrument, the students can't read all the transposing score pieces. Like it's just like another thing that just needs to be like, okay, well, if I want to do that, then I need to rethink the upper level labeling of this and this in a university that has a building dedicated just to keys, it just can feel overwhelming to try to handle administration. It's just massive in some schools.
Yeah, I often think of it like, and this gets to Pete's essay too, but it's like grassroots organizing almost, right? Like you have to kind of like find a buddy and agree with them, and then find like another buddy, and then find like a buddy like sub area, and kind of like build it up from there, which I think like, yeah, Pete's essay kind of addresses like how to do that, but it's not like a top down thing. And it's not something everybody can just like sit down at a faculty meeting with like 30 people and just like hash it out, right? You have to kind of like build up these structures from the bottom, and not everybody has the kind of privilege to do that.
Something Chelsea mentioned a little bit earlier made me think of yet another pressure I think that comes to bear here. I was chatting with one of the authors of one of the textbooks in my corpus study, and they were saying, I can't remember how we got on the topic, but they said, oh yeah, that chapter on such and such, little harmonic progression or whatever, the publishers insisted that we put that in there, because every other textbook has that, right? And so, and I don't think that was an isolated, incident, right? And also just like the length of these textbooks, right? I think there's a lot of pressure on these publishers to provide an alternative that's actually pretty close to what's already, status quo, right? And so we have this, Chelsea's doing a circle in her screen, this very tight, circle, self-reinforcing circle of reproducing the same stuff that we did last year, the same textbook as the ones that are out there already. So the pressures are I think enormous, they're coming from all sides.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of all sides, Pete, your essay really shows all the other sides that we need to think about. And kind of thinking of all the other constituencies that we have. We've been talking about a little bit of what students' needs are, and a little bit of what our fellow faculties, but even thinking about the administration and all these big picture ideas. And talk to us a little bit about kind of the things that we need to be thinking about. If, like, as you open your article, it's like, you've decided you're going to do it, right? Well, going to put a wet blanket on us and say it's too hard. But what are the other things that we need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this has already come out in our discussion, in Chelsea's essay and Bill's points and everything. It has a lot to do with what are you focused on? We've talked a lot about the students already. Where are they coming from? Where do we want them to go? And that difficulty. And, Chelsea talks already, we've already talked about the faculty issues and workloads and fostering those relationships, I think, are very important. And if anything, my essay is just talking about, think about all of the connections. If you have the one thing in the middle, and just how big is your web of things that you have to consider, and how important it is to communicate those things. And so with the administration, it's just that in some ways, I'm not an administrator. I don't want to be an administrator. I want to go in. I just want to teach my class and enjoy things with my students and their learning. But you want to know how really you are fitting into the institution and creating important relationships, healthy relationships with all of these constituencies, and with your administration, I think is very important. So the one thing I mentioned, and this is from one of my administrators, he often talks about and I remember we as a group were talking about this. Well, there's like the 100-foot view and a 1,000-foot view and a 10,000-foot view. And we were debating, well, maybe it should be a 100,000-foot view or a 9,000-foot view. And we were debating the scale to which we're trying to get perspectives. And in some ways, my essay isn't about Chorale at all. It's more general, right? It's just about curricular issues and curricular changes. And maybe this is just one thing. But yeah, if you go in, and I think if you're an enthusiastic, I'm fresh out of grad school, I'm just going to just throw everything out and start from scratch. And there's just so many things you need to consider, like you're forcing a change on your senior faculty colleagues who are going to be writing your letters for tenure, right? There's so many things like that to consider. So that's kind of what my essay is getting at. And more than anything, it's talk. I would encourage us to not keep our doors closed. I would encourage you, if your colleagues' doors are open, go in and talk to them, including your administrators. And you just never know what may crop up in those conversations. I know that's easier said than done sometimes. We tend to stay focused, and we're often overworked anyway. In some ways, but making the efforts and maybe putting in a little bit more work what would the domino, if I knock this one domino over, what is it going to produce? Or if I start pulling this thread on a sweater, right? Is there a point where it's like, okay, I can cut this thread off and the sweater is still intact, right? The curriculum is still good, everybody has their place, the sleeves are still there. Or if I start pulling this thread and everything falls apart, well, that's maybe a weird analogy, but I think that works, right?
No, I think that makes total sense, because one of the issues with SATB writing or this chorale writing that we do have to think about is with our students and the recruitment of them, and then the placement, right? You mentioned placements for our graduating students who go on to grad school, and making sure that we're a school that other schools aren't saying, oh no, this person's from the XYZ State University, they don't know their part writing, right? I mean, talk to us about things that we need to think about as related to those student issues and SATB.
Yeah. So, and I think this gets a little bit back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, just in terms of my hope is that there are more acceptance of the variety of institutions and where students are coming from. So I think if we think in terms of, okay, we're going to have a curriculum that does not have any voice leading or limits the study of chorale, then are we worried that, oh, well, that may hinder their chances to get into a certain graduate school? Or are we trying to say, well, now if some institutions do that, then no graduate entrance exams should now include voice leading or chorale style harmonization? I don't think we should say either of those things. I think, and we're an all undergraduate institution, so we think very much about placing students right into graduate programs. But I think graduate entrance exams, if they're going to be adapted, they should be adapted in such a way that meets students from the different types of places where they came from. I don't think there needs to be any limiting in terms of, well, okay, this brand new school has this amazing curriculum, but they don't do chorale style part writing or whatever. Then if you're at one of those graduate schools, you need to seriously consider, well, maybe we need to change how we view students coming from that rather than dismissing them. One of the big things I've learned, I think, in thinking about this is you don't be dismissive. Don't be dismissive of your students' needs, of your colleagues' needs. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, I guess. So I don't know if that addresses totally with the students moving on, but I think don't be dismissive of a student that comes from any type of institution. And so I think the idea of graduate entrance exams, it shouldn't be they should assess chorale part writing or not. I think it needs to be something other than yes or no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as the curriculums change, textbooks change, who knows what's going to be on those. But I think that kind of open-handed, kind of gracious attitude, I think, is so helpful. And there are opportunities, as you mentioned, if you reach out to those administrators for money, for, if you're willing to ask, if you're in a department or a school that wants innovation, wants to be more inclusive and diverse, there could actually be potential for assistance with that, right?
Yeah, and this kind of gets to what Jenn was saying too about the slow burn or the long game. I think that's very important, and relationships take time. So and as those relationships build, I think talking with your colleague, well, what if we tried this? What if we altered this a little tiny bit? And going to your administrators to say, I think we want to try to do this. Maybe there's something in place at your institution where you could get a little bit of grant money or something to do a curricular redesign. A lot of places have that, I think. And in terms of and this is me just, again, I encourage people to, like Jenn, I think, do try to think long-term, try to think the long game. Small incremental changes, but within those incremental changes, that actually gives you more and more opportunities to present those ideas to your faculty or to other departments. If you want to try to get interdisciplinary ideas, if you try to do everything all at once, you're going to get burned out faster than we already do, I feel like. Keep the conversations going. Don't forget about your administrators and hold them accountable too. Don't just, one of my scenarios is, okay, they give you a blank check. You're the theorist, do whatever you want. No, really press them, I think, and say, how is this going to affect our students, and how might this change our institution? What is your institution's mission? What are you trying to do with your students? It's all important stuff.
That really is. Yeah, thanks for raising a lot of those good points. You got to build the relationships. Otherwise, where are we going? You're just going to fight up against a big wall and just keep ramming your head into that same wall over and over again, which is so defeating. And you're trying and it's hard. So speaking of the whys and hows of this undergraduate music theory courses, Kate, your article I loved my favorite part of the article. You probably never guessed that this is my favorite part, but it was when you said "in the wild" in quotes, because I thought that was so funny. I just started laughing out loud when I was reading it.
I love it.
It was implying that what we're doing is not music in the wild. It's just, this other thing. And I was cracking up so hard when I read you're in the wild. But I know that wasn't very central to what you were saying, but maybe you can enlighten us beyond in the wild, some of the adjustments that you've made to your courses and things like that.
Well, I mean, actually in the wild, I think it's an important conversation point in my classrooms with my students. I, for the most part, have been teaching theory in liberal arts environments. So I have music majors and non-majors and minors, and then like the random CS major who wants to take a music course or computer science major who wants to take a music course in the room all at the same time. So a lot of what I am thinking about when I'm teaching theory is how do I sort of meet my students in the resonant spaces that they occupy most often. And so how can I frame a concept that, a concept like harmony or tonality, for instance, in a way that maybe is easier or more immediately graspable by somebody who hasn't grown up or been educated, from the age of 6 or whatever in this particular system that many of us exist in. And so, for instance, like sometimes I talk about tonality, like the sun and the solar system, and this feeling of a pull of gravity to one place. And the in the wild thing comes from a little bit of engineering and a little bit of computer science and a little bit of physics. Like I remember in classes when I was in high school, we learn these formulas for things and they all exist in frictionless vacuums, right? You have some theorem for a thing, and this is the set of letters. And if you follow this equation and plug in all the things in this frictionless vacuum, it will all, sort of pay out. It'll all add up. And in CS, I think one of the phrases that sometimes gets used is assume a spherical cow, which is just like, sort of assuming this perfect thing that doesn't actually exist, go forward from here. And so, a lot of what I prioritize in my classes with my students is encouraging them to be flexible in their expectations of how these things we teach them in the abstract actually show up or get used or utilized in music. And so, I'd like to tell you that all 7 diminished 7 labels move to 1, but that's not actually true. Or that we tend to teach, if we're talking about 3-note chords, we're talking about triads, and there's 4 qualities of triad: major, minor, augmented, and diminished. But in reality, my Theory 1 students are not going to see an augmented triad in their, sort of regular day-to-day life, but we teach them all as if they're sort of equally weighted in that beginning point of study. And so, I think having the conversation of the why I chose to say this thing, or why I chose to leave this thing out, or spend more time on an element of, where would you take a breath if you were going to sing this line, as a way of helping you to lead you towards thinking about closure and cadences, rather than presenting it in a different way, are some of the ways that I think about my theory courses. And most often it roots from wanting transparency and clarity with the students, so they know where I'm coming from, and so they can, as easily as possible, take a concept in theory class and make it make sense in the space of music, but also take it back to whatever their larger programs or other programs of study or practice in music outside of class might be.
I also laughed at the in the wild because I say that too. So I don't know, we must be reading the same things. One of the things I really like that you said is that you talk to the students about how each song or each piece of music kind of has its own container, its own like space that it lives in and parameters that it's working in. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit more for those listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the container thing for me comes actually from being a composer, because I tell people I'm a composer and they say, "Oh, what kind of music do you write?" Or like, "Who are the composers that you write like?" And so often in the question, they're asking me to put myself in a space with other people or with other existing things. And I always really struggle with that question. But I think in the essay, I talk about thinking about any kind of container and the different properties it might have. So maybe it doesn't have a lid, or maybe instead of rigid sides, it has flexible sides, or maybe the material can sort of be pushed and molded. And again, this comes from the sort of origins of my education and sort of thoughts as a maker. And I think one of the ways that these conversations about how music works, and what are these sort of component parts that are all going together to make something work for us as listeners or performers, is really encouraging sort of a flexibility of approach, right? So, it doesn't make sense to put a bunch of Roman numerals on two-voice counterpoint from the 16th century. I mean, if we're going to sort of go to the furthest extreme, right? Because each of those things are yielding sort of different intention. Or one of the examples that I use in the essay is from a song from the musical Hamilton, where there's just rampant sevenths, intervals between the melody, the voice, and the bass line. And for a lot of that opening part of the piece, it really is just the singer and that bass low register piano. And that we maybe then have to think about how we're talking about the function of the interval of the seventh, not as a dissonance that would resolve as a leading tone up to tonic, or that needs to resolve down by step, in sort of passing, right? But that we're saying, oh, this is a thing, an object that I notice. But the container metaphor is encouraging students to think about sort of being flexible in the spaces that object can live in, and how that object's meaning changes depending on the container in which it's hanging out in that given moment.
As a composer, I really resonate with that. And it makes total sense thinking about your article that you're a composer, because it sounds like a composer wrote it. I mean, the metaphors, the poetic kind of ideas.
Yeah.
But I think that's, as a composer, we think of our pieces as these kind of self-contained kind of islands or entities, right? That have their own rules, that have their own logic, right? And so that allows, and that inherent in that is that this flexibility that, anything can happen as long as it's kind of operating in these rules that I, as the composer, get to design, right? And I think that's a positive when teaching theory, is to have this little bit more flexible, open view of composition and what happens in music. It's not this like fixed thing that these composers are working with necessarily, but it's more kind of this open thing, and every piece is kind of its unique thing.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting. So people who listen to this podcast will know I'm a composer, but there's nothing that identifies me as a composer in the essay. So there's your little Easter egg for the day. But I think, one of the things that I really love about Bill's essay in Neo-Romanian Theory is he's also like giving us new containers to think about theory and how we just think about how music works, and sort of asks us really, just sort of the other side of the coin of that idea of this flexibility that we're all really sort of pushing in the colloquy.
I mean, Bill, she set you up with the perfect segue. We don't even have to do it. Jen and Ben and I, we're just going to sign off and leave you 6 to just finish out the show.
Need us at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, I'm in this position of my essay is the last one. And I actually don't think I was last in the panel session, because I remember thinking that like, all right, now Kate and I are the transition to maybe what can you do instead? Like we've diagnosed some of the issues. We've talked about the big, things that go on institutionally and among individual faculty members, and, what might you do? And I like to think of Neo-Romanian theory as something that comes up and it looks at voice leading in this totally different way. We talked earlier about, can you separate voice leading from chorales? Should you? And, I think one of the good things about looking at Neo-Romanian theory is that it's such a different view of voice leading, and it totally hinges on voice leading, but it brings you into totally different styles of music. So one thing you asked me to sort of quickly and simply define Neo-Romanian theory, it's a bit of a contested term these days with sort of what is and what isn't, and should you still be using it. But basically, Neo-Romanian theory is this sort of set of approaches to music that are heavily influenced by 19th and early 20th century German music theory, primarily the work of Hugo Riemann, whom it's named after as a sort of, new Riemann or revived Riemann, but other theorists too. And it's a way of looking at relationships between triads. We use it generally to look at chromatic relationships. But the really cool thing about it is it looks at sort of individual voices moving, whether those are literal, note to note motions or sort of more in pitch classes. But you're looking for half steps and whole steps and things like that. And so one of the things that I really love to do with Neo-Romanian theory is look back at things we've already done. Here's a completely different way of understanding this progression that maybe didn't fit in or was presented as this really, out of the box thing when we encountered it earlier, this modulation that Schubert has or something like that took a lot of explaining. Now we have a theory that we come back to at the end of the semester, and it sort of can explain very concisely, oh, it's a P and an L, once you learn this language of parallel, relative, Layton Wechsel transformations, and many, many others.
One of the things I really liked and enjoyed when I read the article was that it kind of, so you introduce this in theory 3, is that right? That's where you start to kind of use this language with your students. Yeah. And I liked how you talk about how you do teach chorale style writing in earlier semesters, and that this is a way to help them bridge that sort of understanding that they've learned previously into a much broader and more diverse repertoire, and to help them see the connection there. Mm-hmm. That's often what we're all trying to do and hoping that they're able to do, but sometimes I worry, like, is that happening? Mm-hmm. And so I really liked that you're kind of drawing that line there for the students and helping them expand it out.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's this really interesting opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain on music theory, which I feel like we're sometimes reluctant to do. That's one of the many forces that's involved in this whole conversation, is the desire to be as consistent as possible, as, kind of fair and predictable. We talked about grading before and how chorales kind of facilitate that. And so, like, looking at Neo-Romanian or transformational theory, like, it lets you kind of say, okay, there are many aspects of theory that are still kind of developing. This has only been a part of the lexicon for 25 years. As I said, it's the terminology is sort of contested. People are still sort of figuring out when and how to use this theory. And it really explicitly sets you up for all the things that we already will ask them to do in theory 4. Suddenly you have to think about pitch classes. Suddenly you have to think about things that are inverting in these hypothetical spaces. And, I think of this as a kind of friendlier way to get into that, visualizing things. And you can just do really cool things with it. One of the things I say in the paper is one of my students calls them music theory cheat codes, which is like my favorite student comment that I've ever gotten, which, number one, it's perfect because they're really fun to play with. They're really rewarding analytically, but they're amazing to compose with and to just kind of sit down at the piano and you can create all these wild progressions. But the thing that I really like about the music theory cheat codes comment is that for that student, who, had a lot of trouble with some aspects of theory 3, they work in such a different way. Transformational theory works in such a different way that for some students, it just clicks in this way that maybe other material doesn't. And suddenly they're thinking about harmony differently, and it really like locks in for them. And they suddenly get this charge out of music theory.
If I could jump in, Bill, if that's okay, just I don't just on this point of Neo-Romanian using them in the theory classroom. We just I'd like to say it's because of you, Bill, that we just started using more Neo-Romanian theory. We just introduced it for the first time last year, I guess it was, and so just a quick anecdote in terms of having not done Neo-Romanian theory, at least in the core undergraduate sequence, and then now having done it, I guess this will be the second year that we'll do it. The connections that you talk about, that the students can connect to the music, it was very obvious. It was very evident. It happened immediately. It opened up the new repertoire, and so we were able to bring in more film music and not lose any of the whatever you want to call it, fidelity of the voice leading, critical thinking aspect of it. I think so. So yeah, I think it's good. I think more and more, as you know, more and more places are trying it out, using it. We are, and I think and we're going to shift things kind of like how you've suggested it, in terms of, well, it used to be in our theory 4, but now we're going to move a little bit earlier to help open up those ideas for later on. So that's just a quick anecdote, at least from my end.
No, I absolutely love the integration with film music. That's what I first thought of when I started reading your article, actually. I was like, oh my gosh, it sounds like Frank Lehman. And I've been working on this separate film music project for some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's like, oh gosh, it just reminds me of Frank Lehman so much. And then I scroll down, there it is. There's an example of film music. Right, I was like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. That's kind of where this would go. And such a great way of doing it. I mean, I tried to go through some of Lehman's stuff recently, and it just takes me so long. And I think part of it is because I didn't have that in my undergrad. I didn't have that kind of background. So I'm like, it's taking me too long to process all this stuff. It shouldn't take me this long, I'm a professional music theorist, Yeah. But maybe with that background, it all comes down to what we did in our undergrad, and now having the open-mindedness enough to go back and revisit that. And I think Kate actually makes the point of taking that and saying, okay, this is, where we came from, and having the wherewithal and open-mindedness to say, okay, some of those things are good, some of those things are bad, and just kind of going through that. For me, definitely Neo-Romanian theory is one of the things that I just haven't, gotten the fluency with it yet that I would like to have, especially engaging, as I said, with film music. It helps so much.
I think that's one of the things that is sort of really inspiring about both Bill and Kate's essays, is the ways that they just sort of open up other possibilities, so that even if you weren't an expert in those areas, that you can see ways to use it, and that you will see your students take it up possibly much more quickly than you will, because it opens up things for them that they find challenging and that they haven't been sitting with for a long time in other realms. And so I find that really exciting about just the ways of that it sort of just starts that process in totally new paths for them.
I can't remember which one of you mentioned this in your article, but one of you said something like, for some students, part writing ends up being just like a hoop you have to jump through to get done with this class or whatever. Some students find it completely just totally irrelevant and boring, and they don't understand why we're doing it. Some students love it because it's a puzzle and they have to kind of figure it out. And I thought, I wonder, my friends who I went to college with, how do they view part writing? And do they see it as useful now that they are many years out of school and have been working in music for a long time? And so I texted them and I asked them, and the response was hilarious. It's probably exactly what you expect, because one of them said, I think at the time I viewed it as a hoop that I had to get through, just something I had to learn to get through theory. But now I see how, sometimes I'm working on something with my students and the arrangement isn't quite right, and I have to rearrange it. And those skills that I learned have been really, really useful. And I couldn't do those things if I hadn't learned that. And the other person responded and said, I don't remember what part writing is. Can you tell me? ? And I thought, well, right there it is. We cannot predict what they're going to need or how useful it's going to be. It's such a challenging thing to do. And I just love I like the idea of like just having more tools in the toolbox, because something is going to reach one student, as you said, that maybe has struggled with everything else in the class, but then Neo-Romanian theory makes it click for them. Maybe somebody didn't think part writing was important. Now they're using it to rearrange, children's choral arrangements, and they see the value of it now. And maybe someone else is like, I don't remember what that is. Can you tell me? I was like, do you remember how we're not supposed to write parallels? And she was like, oh, yeah, that rings a bell. So,
Yeah, and that like gets to, I mean, the most exciting thing that we do is that we are kind of like shaping the future of music and stuff like that. And so it's like we get into the chicken and egg thing with this, right? Where you're like, well, yeah, like I walked out into a world where everybody else had part writing, and so I had part writing too, and so that's the messiness of trying to kind of like figure out what we're doing, and trying to keep like these future musicians in mind, which is like the goal of everything we do, which can definitely get lost in the bureaucracy and the difficulty and the the nitty-gritty of it all.
Yeah, I had kind of tagging along to that again is I had one of my friends that teaches band in Pennsylvania. We played together jazz professionally, and he was teaching AP theory, and he's a couple weeks in, he's like, can you remind me really quickly why parallel fifths are so bad? And I was like, hold on, let's just stop right there before you even finish your remark. I just want to stop you, And then I had thought back because at school the week before, one of my colleagues had come in and said, I heard that you said in class that parallel fifths were permissible. I'm like, dude, I heard parallel fifths on the way over here to the school today. Like, so it's just all these like perspectives coming in together, and like, can we just like talk about style, but yeah, it's hard to start even conversations with people because like you have so many things going in that they're coming from, and you kind of have to, kind of back to Pete's point is like, don't dismiss, but like, where can I meet you in the middle where we can come to like this understanding, of different aspects of what we're teaching at various levels from high school through college, through grad school. I mean, all of it, it's all a can of worms.
And I think it harkens back to Marcy's earlier point about just trying to sort of talking about like good voice leading, right? Just the word good, shifting some of our vocabulary that automatically assigns value to a practice. Good voice leading, bad range choice, like, what's sort of successful or permissible even, right? Like, the idea of something being permissible or not allowed, like, this idea of negation. I think that there's a lot of language sort of inherently built into this, into how we talk about theory. And who was it at the plenary in 2019 in the whole plenary in SMT in 2019, there was a lot of conversation about language and vocabulary and what's, like the ideal form for a sonata or any of these structures, and trying to sort of shift away also from just that vocabulary that we use so often without thinking about it, because that's the way a lot of us were exposed to music theory.
I think you're thinking of Joe Strauss's paper, I think, right? At the plenary. Yeah.
And so, and just I think the vocabulary choice about how we qualify any of these practices is a really important, and it's an important topic that we definitely didn't explore in this colloquy, but maybe we put that on the agenda for our next meeting.
Well, but I think that's a good point. And it's not just about, I mean, I don't know. No, I don't think any of us are saying chorale is good or bad, right? I mean, it's just, nope. we need to think about it. And I mean, maybe some of us might feel more strongly than others, but yeah, I just think just to reiterate that, Kate, I think it's important to keep that in mind. What's good or what's bad, and to try to move away from that.
This is the end of finals week for me, and I know for Ben and probably for most of you. So I really thank you so much for meeting with us at this really busy time of year. But this is I've really enjoyed this. It's been such a great way of ending the week at a very busy time of year. I thought we could do maybe some real quick rapid fire. That's what we'd like to do with our guests normally. Is just each of us are going to ask you just a real quick question. You just answer right off the top of your head. I'll start with mine. I think I have mine. Do you have yours, Jenn or Ben? Okay, we didn't talk about this at all. So my question is, what's the one composer who is not in theory textbooks or in theory textbooks very much now that will be in theory textbooks 50, 100 years from now?
This in an ideal world?
Yes,
in
this in your ideal world.
Can I go first?
Sure.
Sorry, I saw Bill. Go ahead. We can't hear you, Bill.
Oh, we lost your audio, Bill.
Still no audio.
Go ahead, William.
I was going to say Billie Eilish. She may very well figure in music theory textbooks, but I haven't seen. I'm out of touch, but fantastic stuff. And so creative, and in ways that I think, North American music theory just doesn't know what to do with yet, I think.
Good.
I'm going to go cop out and just say, I'm not convinced that we'll have a music theory textbook in 50 or 100 years that we would be like, this is in the textbooks, because I think things are fragmenting and moving in, very different directions in different places.
Good.
Yeah, I also want to get meta about this because I was thinking about my answer, which for the record, I've been fangirling out about St. Vincent lately, and I just think she does great stuff musically, production-wise, etc. But then I was thinking about my value system for kind of, choosing that artist, and I'm well, we could talk about her chords, we could really talk about St. Vincent's chords, and then I was I don't know if that's what the future will be, is cool chords.
We can't get away from harmony.
I'm also going to cheat in my answer and say more musical theater. Broadly.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have an answer to this, but I was going to go a little bit there, Kate. It's hard to say. Taylor Swift is huge right now. Taylor Swift concerts or conferences, right? So I feel like there is going to be, and since the scholarship is more and more on these sorts of things, why not Sondheim, right? Or something. And so more of that, and the types of innovations that came out of that, I think. So that's not one answer. Yeah,
that's great. And then Bill has put in the chat, let's see, Amy Beach and Kate Pukinskis. All right.
Well, that's
why
so
not?
Sweet.
Jenn or Ben?
I can just cop out as well and say minor do or minor law. That's a popular rapid fire question. So there you go. Minor do or minor law.
Nice.
Minor do.
Minor do, all the way.
Same.
Also, scale degrees, for the record.
Yes, scale degrees. Firm, yes.
135.
Pluralism.
Ecumenical solfege systems.
We don't have any fixed do people in here? Nobody?
I was educated in fixed do. My bachelor's degree was fixed do, and I really appreciate it because I have nice, accurate pitch, but I don't think I would force it on anybody in the future.
So for our listeners, I think Bill is having audio problems, but I think he said minor do. Am I right?
Minor, yeah. Did I just?
Oh, you're back.
Did I just fix it? Yes.
Yes. We're back.
I did all these fancy things and nothing worked, and then I just unplugged the headphones and plugged them back in, and that fixed it. Yeah, I actually used to be kind of a law-based minor person, but then I saw the light. I stopped. I started to realize that had a lot more problems that it raises.
Mine is oral skills or theory. What do you take if you could only have one?
Ouch. I'm going to go, I think I'm actually going to go oral training. I've always been interested in listener reactions and starting with the listener for analysis. And So I'm gonna. That's a hard question, but I the first thing that popped into my head actually was no. I think oral training it's more useful. Thinking about our students. Not that theory's not important. I love my theories, but what's going to be more practical for the future choir directors and orchestra directors, and I'll go with oral training.
Can you clarify? I don't really understand. Like, do you mean when you say oral versus theory, do you mean that theory just means written, or do you mean like what do you mean by theory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It's totally a loaded question. That's part of the reason I ask it. I kind of want to see what people say. Is that I'm implying that you would have like strictly oral skills and then you would have strictly written theory, which obviously probably none of us actually teach that way. But, if you had to somehow, teach mainly via oral skills, I guess, or mainly via written skills, where do you kind of see that? How do you kind of see that playing out? Or if you had to choose only one sequence, I think a lot of people split that up. How would you approach that?
I'm gonna go improvisation as like a third way.
Yeah, I was gonna say like dissolve the distinction. I think the most successful ways of teaching written theory involve a lot of sight singing, and depending on the way different institutions do that, like you can kind of feel hamstrung of like, well, I should be doing this when I have you these 2 or 3 days a week or whatever, because you're doing that in the other one, but actually the most effective thing would be to do them both.
I think I would go oral. I mean, I think also that I'm a little bit biased. Several of the folks in this group did our graduate work at University of Chicago, and one of the courses that you teach when you're there is Intro to Music Analysis and Criticism, but anybody can take it. So you're teaching analysis through oral means as the structure for a course. And it's actually like a really beautiful and delightful course to teach, just to think about like how to understand the music even without sort of the kinds of concepts that you learn so deeply in written theory, which I also think are really important to learn through oral means. And I just taught a popular music course where I know a lot of people do written transcription as a big part of their popular music course. And we did just like the tiniest bit of that. And that was it. I mean, I just really wanted them to be focusing on their ears, Yeah. And Marcy just wrote in the chat that she still thinks that's music theory. And I totally agree. And that's why I asked that question, like, what do we mean by that? So if you had to deliver the music theory concepts through oral means or through written means, and you had to do just one of those, I guess I would say oral, because music is still sound, right? And that's our hope, is to connect to a sonic experience or a sounding experience for me, at least, and the way I think about my teaching.
I'm hearkening back to the In the Wild, so I would go oral skills if that's the way we're going to go. But I also don't accept the premise that they're separate functions.
Oral skills is more of a survival skill, right? If you're out in the wild,
yes,
you will survive more with oral skills. How's that?
That's also accurate.
Yeah, I'm going to go hard oral skills myself. I one of the things I'm sort of bent out of shape about, very often is how much we're fixated on visuality, on visual technology like writing and visual metaphors for conceptualization, stuff like that. I think that goes almost without question. Even to say, like, when we use the word theory, we mean written theory, and we can use the word music to refer to a score, right? As if they're coterminous or whatever, and they're totally not, right? There's so much that's included and focused on and digested and interpreted in the notation that we have, and there's so much that's sort of excluded in the process. So I would love to interrogate a heck of a lot more than we do already, all this visuality and these visual metaphors and technologies that we incorporate as a matter of course in music theory.
No, I love it. That's precisely the reason why I asked this, because it always something always comes up like this, and it just gives me seemingly a new perspective every time I ask somebody that in a rapid fire. So maybe the question in the future can maybe be in the wild, if you're only having to survive with one skill. Is it Roman numerals or solfege? I'm just kidding.
You could even be on Naked and Afraid and take it with. You don't need, I mean, you have a knife and your oral skills there. Well, this has been such a treat. And for all you listening, go check out their article, Corralling the Chorale, in the latest edition of the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. You're going to have so many things to think about, ideas to take away. And I think the way you all have just written about, and I think, as you mentioned, the voice leading and part writing is certainly one thing that we need to examine. But I think once you read the article, you start thinking about all these other things that you're assuming have to be or are part of theory, and that you start thinking, well, maybe we can make room for these other things or expand these other things out. So thank you so much. This has been a treat. And I know you all have, well, some of you are on sabbatical, so you're all enjoy the Vermont mountains and things like that. But some of us have things to grade or projects to finish. And I know it's a hectic time of year, but thank you again so much. This has been such a fun time. And we'd love to do it again.
Yeah, thank you guys.
So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening to Note Doctors, the Music Theory and Pedagogy podcast. We will be back with more interviews with professors and teachers who will be dropping all sorts of theory knowledge for your education, edification, and enjoyment. So until then, bye-bye.